Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So in light of the release of the Suicide Squad, I thought it'd be a fun idea to go through my thoughts on all of the DCEU films to date. Yes, we're finally going to sit down and try and rank all of the DCEU films. I've already done several videos like this on my channel, ranking the films from phase 1 and 3 of the MCU, as well as DreamWorks films, Pixar films. You know, there's a bunch of ranking videos on this channel. I love me a good list, okay? And so if you'd like to check out more ranking videos, you can do so in my movie chats playlist. You'll have a lot of fun over there. But today it's finally time for the DCEU to join the ranks of those videos on my channel, because we are going to be breaking down my thoughts on all of the DC films that have been released in the last decade or so. Now, some of you guys may already be thinking, this is interesting coming from Jean because she has a certain bias. Listen, yes, I am biased towards the MCU. I do love me a good Marvel film, like that's no secret around here. But above all else, I am a big fan of quality. I am a big fan of excellence. Okay, that has always been the most important thing for me. And honestly, that's one of the reasons why I've been drawn to the MCU to begin with, because of their consistency. And I feel like that's some of the issues that I have with the DCEU, is the lack of consistency. And I've already discussed at length my thoughts on the issues that the DCEU has and has had up until now, and I have a full analysis video on my channel as well. So even though I do have a bias towards Marvel, I have dedicated a lot of time to actually analyzing and being fair towards the DCEU when sharing my thoughts with you guys. So I have fun over here just discussing, you know, comic book, movie and TV show content as a whole. You know, there's no hard feelings, okay? It's really not that deep. I'm wearing blue to support the team. It's not that deep. But before we delve into my ranking of the DCEU films, first of all, I just wanted to let you know that I will be including some films that may not strictly be in the DCEU. The DCEU is tough to kind of define because it's not as linear as the MCU is. Like, you know, all of the films that Marvel Studios has released for the last, you know, over a decade have all been included in the MCU, whereas that's not strictly the case for DC. So it's tough to know what's canon or what's not, especially because you have a couple of films that are actually kind of redos of original films that were already on the DC slate. So it's a little bit more complicated. I'm just going to be including all of them, okay? All of the live action DC films that we have gotten since Man of Steel, I think. And that will include the Joker, because listen, Joker's an excellent film. Like, I feel like it would be unfair to include it from this conversation. And secondly, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Now, without further ado, let's get into my ranking of the DCEU films. So we're starting off at number 12 with 2017's Justice League. Now, I'm going to try and keep these rundowns as short as possible because I know I can talk a lot and there's like 12 films that we need to get through, so it's worrying. It's worrying. I don't trust myself. So I'll just say this. The internet has a plethora of videos giving you guys analyses of what went wrong with the Justice League. I don't need to tell you that it's a bad film. I don't need to tell you that it's a weird mishmash of two different directing styles plopped together due to unfortunate circumstances. I don't need to tell you that. I don't need to tell you that it has a tonal problem, that it has a visual problem, because it's like so ugly. It is so ugly. And the thing is, okay, I kind of understood where Joss Whedon was coming from in terms of trying to bring more color, to bring more life into the Justice League film after Zack Snyder departed, because I've said many times on this channel, I do not like the desaturated color aesthetic that Zack Snyder brings to the DCEU. I just don't. So I did kind of appreciate the fact that Joss Whedon tried to bring in some color, tried to also insert some comedy, into his version of the Justice League when he took over. But unfortunately, the story is just a mess. I mean, you have one film that is trying to condense what Marvel did with a decade's worth of filmmaking. Like, it was never going to be possible. You know, this was supposed to be their version of the first Avengers film, except this time around, the majority of the Justice League hadn't gotten their own solo films, and so we didn't really get to know them. We didn't really understand where they were coming from, and the only introduction that we had gotten for these characters was previously in Batman vs Superman with with Bruce Wayne's emails, the emails that he managed to hack into, and we got that little slideshow with each of the characters and their power sets really quickly. But that wasn't enough to really establish these characters, and so when we get to the Justice League, we have to play catch up with trying to establish these characters and make them, you know, likable and people that we can root for, whilst at the same time trying to establish the team dynamics and then also trying to establish the stakes. And it wasn't helped by the fact that, of course, due to unforeseen circumstances, Zack Snyder had to leave the project and it was just brought into chaos as a result. So then next up at number 11, we have Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. God, what can I even say about this film? This was it. Like, this was the film that started a lot of the issues that the DCEU faced. Now, I already discussed in my DCEU analysis video how for the majority of its run, it's been trying to play catch up to the MCU. I mean, the DCEU officially started with Man of Steel in 2013, I believe. And so it was already several years behind when it started. And then you have a film like Batman v Superman, which was really trying to thrust it forward and really try to carry on the story of Superman whilst introducing this world's version of Batman. I mean, you have two of the most iconic characters in comic book lore fighting against one another at a time when comic book movies were at their peak, at their height. It should have been a done deal. It should have been a billion-dollar movie easily. But instead, because of the creative choices of Zack Snyder, the film was a bit of a bomb. Like, the film really did not perform the way the studio wanted it to. Now, that doesn't mean that the film didn't make money, because it did. I believe it made over $800 million at the box office worldwide, which is respectable. Like, that's great. But a film about Batman fighting Superman, at the end of the day, should have made $1 billion, especially in the landscape of film that we had in 2016. And mere months later, you had the release of Marvel's Civil War, which had a bunch of basically B, C, even D-list characters going head to head, battling it out because of their own issues. And that made so much more money. Why? Because people were invested in that story. They were invested in those characters in a way that people weren't in the case of DC's Batman and Superman. So for me, Batman v Superman was just a classic example of how DC has always leaned on Batman and Superman to be their prime heroes, to kind of have all of the spotlight to themselves, and neglected a bunch of their other characters. And as a result, whilst these two characters have very much, you know, stayed within the pop culture zeitgeist and have very much become one of the most popular characters of all time, it has meant that unfortunately they can't really lean on their other characters in order to bolster up the franchise as a whole. And so when films that center around Batman or Superman don't do well, the whole family, the whole franchise is left struggling. Whereas in the case of Marvel, they've managed to make obscure characters like Captain America and Iron Man incredibly popular. And so even though they were technically D-list, C-list characters in the comics, they have become part of the zeitgeist. And so people were ultimately really invested in them fighting against one another. Now, aside from that, aside from the fact that the film underperformed, considering the fact that it was focused on Batman and Superman fighting it out, if you watch the film itself, the fight itself is like very disappointing. The fight, like, for a film that's called Batman v Superman, you would expect the film to like be about them fighting against one another and Batman coming up with these creative ways to try and take down Superman. But in reality, like, there's very little of that. Instead, the film is stuffed to the brim, like just completely saturated with over the top, on the nose religious commentary. I have said this before, but I'll say it again. Zack Snyder is all all style and no substance. You don't need to have taken philosophy for you to be able to see that this film is superficial as hell. You don't even need to have walked into a philosophy class by accident and then awkwardly walked out of that class and apologized to the lecturer for you to see that this film is superficial as hell. I happen to have taken some philosophy modules, so I was looking down at this film like, what's going, like, there's nothing interesting being discussed here. But you don't even have to have done that. Truly, I promise you, all you need to do is think about it for a second. He thought he was really doing something with the whole Jesus imagery being associated with Superman, like used to depict Superman as this godlike being. And like, it would have been fine the first time, would have been fine the second time. For that to be the whole film, for Lex Luthor to be going off on these, you know, soliloquies about religion and God and this absentee fatherhood of God, for that to be the whole film, please no. Please no. Please abolish this immediately. I was so done. I was so done, because again, it's like this feeling of, wow, I'm really doing something. Wow, I'm really, you know, touching on some really deep philosophical concepts. In reality, the idea of Superman being this godlike being is like so basic. It's like 101 Superman depiction. So I was so frustrated by that. It got particularly annoying as well when Batman v Superman apologists started going around saying like, you're just not smart enough to understand. You're just not smart enough to understand the film. It's like, no, we understand. We understand. The film's not as smart as you think it is. The film's not as smart as it thinks it is. And another issue that I had with the film was with its portrayal of Superman to begin with. This was something that's kind of carried on from Man of Steel, honestly, but I wasn't the biggest fan of how Zack Snyder portrayed Superman as this like dark and brooding and reluctant hero. I feel like there is a time and place for that kind of hero. Like for Batman, like that's usually Batman's thing, no, but when it comes to Superman, like I did feel like he needed to be a little bit more of a Captain America type. He needed to be a little bit more cheesy but genuine and endearing, and just someone that you could really look up to, kind of like a Ted Lasso. Why can't Superman just be a genuine hero who like loved helping people? Instead, in Batman v Superman, he's just like, man, I'm really tired of helping people, like I didn't ask for this. It's just like this reluctant hero type that Zack Snyder gave this character, and I feel like it's unfortunate because it would have been a nice balance to see a hero in Superman that did go out and do his best and was really enthusiastic about it, but Batman is looking at him with suspicion, like we can't trust him, he's too powerful, he's this alien, and what happens when he, you know, goes against us, and look at the destruction that he caused after Man of Steel. So I feel like that would have been a nice kind of balance, you know, in the way that we saw with Captain America Civil War, where you have the earnest Steve Rogers against the more cynical Tony Stark, but instead they're both brooding. But of course you also have the entry of Wonder Woman in Batman v Superman, and a lot of people got really hyped about her entry into this film. I wasn't really the biggest fan though. She's barely in it, she's not like a huge featured character in this film, but I don't know, I just feel like she was a little bit underwhelming. Like I feel like if you go back and rewatch it, you'll definitely notice that she shines better in her own film, not just because she has more screen time obviously, but because of the way that Patty Jenkins directed Gal Gadot in the role. I feel like it's better than what we got under Zack Snyder in Batman v Superman. Of course, the Hans Zimmer score for the character is iconic, no one can take anything away from that, but I feel like her being featured in this film was like, eh. And then of course you have the villain in Doomsday, was that his name? Horrific, terrible, awful, like ugh. He's very much a part of that kind of league of third act villains that are just so ugly in the DCEU. I've said this ad nauseum, but they really needed to fix their third act bad guy fights, like the desaturated ugly grey with the bursts of orange, you know, to contrast the colours. It was just awful. It was just awful and ugly and nonsense on the screen. So yes, ultimately I just really wasn't a fan of Batman v Superman. Like, I really despise that film. I really despise that film. And I was there on opening weekend, okay? No one can tell me anything. I was there on opening weekend. I took my whole family. I was like, okay, let's see this other superhero film. And we were all so bitterly disappointed. Okay, so next up at number 10, we have 2016's Suicide Squad. Now, this is one of the main films that was the most negatively impacted by the critical response and the fan response for Batman v Superman. Because this film was released a mere few months later, Warner Brothers unfortunately rushed to try and fix the film, try to kind of patch it up in light of how people reacted to Batman v Superman, which led to the whole script being reworked within a few weeks, and it led to this kind of trailer production company editing the ultimate film that ended up being released theatrically. It was just a whole mess. Like, it was really a whole mess. And now David Ayer is saying, you know, that the film that was released theatrically wasn't his film. You know, there's an Ayer cut out there somewhere, but it tested poorly, and that's why the studio decided to go down a different route. But ultimately the end result is like unrecognizable to the film that he had in mind, which is unfortunate, because if you're hiring a director, you're hiring them for their vision, you're hiring them for their ideas. And so the idea of him, you know, dedicating so much of his time and his life pretty much to making a film that will have his name on it, ultimately for the film to just be reworked by a third company, a third party, is quite tragic. Like, it's a really terrible situation. But having said all of that, I don't want to see the Ayer cut. I don't want to see the Ayer cut. Please abolish all other versions of the Suicide Squad. I am not interested, okay? If you've seen my review for the Suicide Squad 2021, directed by James Gunn, you already know where I stand. You already know that I don't want to be seeing Ayer's version of any Suicide Squad again, because I've moved on to better things, okay? Way better things. So I'm not interested. This film was dull. This film was trash. This film was really bad. Now, I will say, okay, there are aspects of this film that I enjoyed, okay? We're getting higher up on the list, so there are aspects that I feel like were somewhat redeemable. First of all, the soundtrack. I know the soundtrack is a subject of controversy, because the soundtrack was kind of added in by that trailer making company, because they had used these cool songs in the trailers, but then the studio heads, when they tested the film, felt that that wasn't really reflected in the actual film that David Ayer produced. So they decided to go ahead with this trailer company and like make it feel more like the trailers that they had produced. And as a result, the soundtrack is kind of banging. The soundtrack kind of bangs. I will say the way that the music is used is bad. It's poor. It's very on the nose, but the soundtrack itself is decent. Like, I actually really enjoyed the songs featured in that film. I've listened to them many times since seeing it, so that's definitely a positive. I will also say that aesthetically, I feel like the Suicide Squad was one of the strongest DC films to have been released, especially during that time. I mean, the film won the Academy Award for Best Hair and Makeup for a reason. Like, literally for a reason, because the hair, makeup and costuming was decent. It was very good, and I feel like it did a great job of establishing the signature looks for each of these characters. And while yes, Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn was very overtly sexualized in the first version of Suicide Squad, and I wasn't a fan of that, you can't deny that in that year, come Halloween time, a ton of girls a ton of women all around the world were dressing up as Harley Quinn, and that is because the look is iconic. The look was incredibly easily replicable, and so people could, you know, dye their hair red and blue and recreate that look, and you would instantly recognize the character that that person was trying to be. So I feel like in a lot of ways that aesthetic very much benefited the film, because it became something that you could easily identify the characters and therefore the property with. And then alongside this aesthetic, you also had like the neon, you also had these kind of top trumps cards that come up at the beginning of the film that kind of highlight all of the characters' weaknesses and strengths and everything. And honestly, I thought that was kind of cute. Like, it's a bit cheesy, it's a bit juvenile, but I feel like it wasn't the worst thing. I like the fact that they tried to do something different and interesting with the editing. Ultimately, the biggest crime that this film commits is being just wholly forgettable. Wholly forgettable. I mean, I could have a gun to my head, I wouldn't be able to tell you the plot of this story. I only just recently remembered that the Enchantress was portrayed by Cara Delevingne in this film. Like, I genuinely had erased that from my brain, so I literally didn't know up until when I was rewatching it. Speaking of Cara Delevingne, even though I feel like she was wholly miscast in this film, I will say that another positive that Suicide Squad had going for it was some excellent casting decisions, with Will Smith, Margot Robbie and Viola Davis being great casting choices for the respective roles that they have here. So next up at number 9 we have Birds of Prey. Now this film came out last year, but it feels like it came out 20 years ago. It feels like it came out so long ago. That's not all down to this film. It's also because of the whole pandemic situation. Like, I don't know if you heard, but there's a whole pandemic happening right now. But I really did want to like it. Like, I was genuinely looking forward to seeing this film going into it. But unfortunately, it was just a little bit underwhelming. It just didn't hit the way that I wanted it to. I like Margot Robbie, but I've said before that I'm not the biggest fan of Harley Quinn as a character. I find her to be a little bit grating. I'm sorry. She's just a little bit annoying, and I understand the kind of premise of this character, this kind of cheesecake, quaint character that you wouldn't really suspect of being able to stand up for herself and be a formidable foe, but ultimately that's exactly what she is. And on top of that, there is also this angle of her having been in an incredibly abusive relationship with the Joker, and I understand that the character herself was introduced in Batman the Animated Series and became a really big hit of a character, so I understand all of that. Okay, I know about Harley Quinn, but I just don't like her. Like, with all of that being said, like, I just don't love the character ultimately. And whilst I appreciate the fact that Kathy Yan definitely took the character in a different, more kind of self-fulfilling and empowering direction, ultimately it wasn't one of my favorite entries into the comic book movie genre. I found the plot to be a little bit forgettable, and even though I'm a big fan of Ewan McGregor, he didn't really make for a standout villain in my book. And on top of that, this film also did have the distinction of being an R-rated DC film, and honestly I didn't really feel like the film earned the R rating, especially after seeing the Suicide Squad. I definitely don't feel like Birds of Prey is a real R-rated film. Like, that's not a hard R rating, okay? I definitely feel like it could have been a PG-13, but they wanted it to feel zanier, feel edgier than it actually was. But if you want to hear more about my thoughts on Birds of Prey, this is actually the first DC film in this lineup so far that I actually have a review on already, so you can go ahead and check out my review from last year. So next up at number 8 we have Zack Snyder's Justice League. Now, this is yet another film that I already have a detailed, extensive review on, so you can go ahead and check out my review to hear my thoughts on this film. You'll definitely get a lot more detail, but ultimately I feel a similar way about Zack Snyder's Justice League to what I said about the Suicide Squad and seeing the Ayer cut, in that I know abolish it. I was never excited to see Zack Snyder's version of the Justice League because it was clear to me that I wasn't going to like any of the DC films that he produced after seeing Batman v Superman. Like, I genuinely hated Batman v Superman so much. I was like, why would I want to give him another chance? I've already seen what he does with DC, and it's not something that I would enjoy. So like, I'm not gonna get excited over his cut of the Justice League. Like, I just don't care to see it. But I was happy for him and his fans that he was able to realize his vision for this story. My thing is that I don't like his vision. I genuinely just don't like his vision. I'm sorry. Like, I just don't understand the hype around this director. And I also find it interesting how apparently he has a history of making director's cuts or ultimate cuts of his film, and so it was like no surprise that we would end up having multiple versions of each of these films. Like, he did it for Watchmen, he did it for Dawn of the Dead, and then he also brought it over with Batman v Superman and ultimately with the Justice League cut, although that was a different situation because he had to exit the project. But still, the guy doesn't know how to make a 2-hour movie, is my point. Like, he generally just doesn't know how to make a 2-hour movie, and so it should have been to the shock of no one that we would end up with a 4-hour version of the Justice League. To me, that's just ridiculous. Like, this isn't like Endgame. This isn't like you trying to bring about the culmination of 10 years worth of storytelling. It really did not need 4 hours to do. It really did. It really didn't. And then ultimately, the story itself wasn't really different. And of course it wasn't different because Warner Brothers wouldn't allow him to make a whole different film. he had to use the footage that he already had. But to say that this film is like substantially better than the original is false, because it's the same story. It's the same story of, you know, Steppenwolf trying to get the Infinity Stones. Oh, sorry, I mean the Mother Boxes. And then grab hold of these mother boxes to serve Darkseid for whatever reason. And sure, they kind of expand upon everything. They expand upon everything because it's 4 hours long. But was it really worth it in the end? I will say the film does look more consistent when it comes to its cinematography and its styling, although I will say that kind of falls apart at the end with the kind of post-credit scenes that we get, because they also look very disjointed. They don't feel like they came from the same film, because they didn't. But ultimately, I understand if you're a fan of Zack Snyder and you really wanted to see his version of the film, that you would be really excited for this, but I'm not. I'm not. I don't care for Zack Snyder's DC films, I really don't, and so I wasn't really holding my breath for this to be extraordinarily better. In the end, it was better than the first Justice League, but not by much. Certainly not worth the 4-hour runtime in my eyes. Now we're finally wrapping up the Snyderverse within the DCEU, with the first entry of the DCEU being 2013's Man of Steel. Now, first things first, I have to say, okay, one of the biggest missed opportunities in my eyes when it comes to the DCEU was wasting a perfectly good Superman in Henry Cavill. How did this happen? How did this, like, honestly, it baffles me to this day how they wasted such excellent casting. It truly is heartbreaking, and I know a lot of people are huge fans of Henry Cavill's Superman. I just think aesthetically, like, he looks like the perfect Superman. How can you just like flop that? How can you just miss so much? Like, that's just shocking to me. And clearly, because of its position in this list, this is my favorite of the Snyderverse films. I just feel like it was a really good story of this alien creature who comes down from Krypton. His whole planet was destroyed and he finds a whole new life with the Kents in this like rural area in America, and it really does feel that way. It really does feel like him, you know, discovering his life in adolescence and childhood, only for him to grow up to be a decent human being before he becomes Superman, before he becomes this like godlike being and uses his powers to save the world whilst also making sacrifices. Now, speaking of said sacrifices, I remember at the time when Man of Steel came out that the most controversial thing that the DCE was facing at that moment was the fact that Superman snapped Zod's neck. I remember fans going crazy. I remember comic book aficionados being like, no, 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 no. This is not my Superman. This is unacceptable. Like, I remember the rage that was caused by the fact that Superman had snapped Zod's neck. Everyone was saying that that was just such an un-Superman thing to do. I understood the point of that scene, and even though a lot of people protested against it and said that it wasn't very Clark Kent-y, I got it. Like, I understood it. My issue comes from the whole reluctant Superman as a whole. The fact that that was carried on in Batman v Superman. Like, I just got so tired. It just got so heavy with the constant brooding, the constant reluctance to be the hero that people needed. He would show up and you have this imagery, especially in Batman v Superman, of him hovering over people who are in need and looking up to him, and he's this like reluctant hero, this reluctant god. And I know that Zack Snyder loves delving into this kind of imagery, this kind of powerful, masculine, religious imagery with his superheroes, but I really feel like Superman to his core has this endearing, genuine, lovable quality to him that is a nice contrast to the darkness of Batman. But in the Snyderverse, there is no contrast. In the Snyderverse, there's just desaturation, brooding, and misery. Okay, so next up at number 6, we have Wonder Woman 1984. Okay, so I don't know what to say. This film, okay, I have a review of Wonder Woman 1984 on my channel. You can go ahead and check that out. I praised this film. I really enjoyed it. It was like the first film that I had seen in the cinema in months last year after a massive break due to, you know, lockdown, the pandemic. Remember that pandemic that I mentioned earlier? Yeah, that. Unfortunately, even though I had gotten a chance to see it a little bit earlier in the UK, when it was released elsewhere, I was met with a ton of controversy. People people pointing things out that genuinely I hadn't considered. Like, I hadn't considered the issues of consent surrounding, you know, Steve Trevor inhabiting someone else's body and Diana basically having intercourse with that body against his will. I had not thought of that at all, and that was my bad. I completely understood the criticism that people had for that aspect of the film, but I was just so shocked to see how much that clouded the narrative of the film overall. Now, to be fair, there were also other critiques of this film that I feel like were valid, but ultimately I still stand by the fact that I really had a fun time with Wonder Woman 1984 despite its issues. I mean, yeah, it's easy to say in hindsight, like, you know, there was some not so great parts, but ultimately, like, it really was a fun time. Like, I don't know what to tell you. I was just so shocked to see people's reaction to this film, because usually I'm the one being like, oh, this is nonsense. But despite all that, I will still say that I really enjoyed Gal Gadot's performance in the Wonder Woman sequel. I feel like there was a marked improvement in her acting and her ability to convey emotion. I really felt that. I also think she has great chemistry with Chris Pine as per usual, and it was nice to see him back. And then, of course, we need to talk about my guy, Maxwell Lord. Listen, I really enjoyed him as a villain. I love the fact that he very much played into the hyper-consumerism of the 80s, being this businessman selling you dreams that could never come true, except this time around they can because of this magical stone. And I really enjoy Pedro Pascal just kind of hamming it up and really chewing the scenery. I think he was great as a villain in this film, although ultimately on the flip side, I wasn't the biggest fan of Kristen Wiig's Cheetah. And ultimately, again, it does fall prey to that classic third act curse that DC was suffering from, where the third act is desaturated, it's dark, it's gloomy, you can barely tell what's going on screen, and the CG is looking wobbly as hell. Okay, so next up at number 5 we have Aquaman. Now, if I'm being honest, I haven't really gone back to rewatch Aquaman since the first time I saw it in the cinemas, but I remember having a great time in the cinema. I really enjoyed Jason Momoa's portrayal of Aquaman. I think he's really fun, I think he's really likable, and to me the first Aquaman movie was kind of like this mishmash of like the first Thor film, especially with the conflict between the brothers, half brothers I should say, and also some elements of like Black Panther in there with this like hidden world that no one really knows the existence of, but is secretly very developed. Ultimately, I do remember thinking when I was in the cinema that the parts that I enjoyed the most, the parts that I found to be, you know, the funniest, the most entertaining, were the parts that reminded me of a Marvel film. I feel like, you know, to date, my favorite DC films have been the DC films that have leaned more towards Marvel-isms. I'm not the biggest fan of severe, grim, self-serious DC films. I'm just not. I like it when these films inject a little bit of comedy and levity. I just find it to be a little bit more approachable, especially as someone who never really read the comics, never really was delving into comic book lore, but got into these films because I found them to be entertaining and I enjoyed the character dynamics as opposed to, you know, getting stuck in the comic book specificities. And speaking of Thor and Black Panther, I think that this film doesn't just borrow the Marvelisms in terms of the tone, but also in its ability to world build. I really appreciated the entry of Atlantis into the DCEU through this film, and I also really enjoyed exploring the different environments and ecosystems throughout the 7 seas. I thought that was a very clever angle to go through, especially the kind of depths of the ocean that we saw that was very horror inspired, and that was James Wan obviously delving into his horror roots. That was something very unique to this film that I really had a fun time with. So speaking of a horror director trying his luck over in the DCEU, at number 4 we have Shazam, and I would say that this little experiment was a big hit, because even though this film did not gross a ton of money at the box office, in large contrast to Aquaman, which is $1 billion film, $1 billion film, that's crazy. I do feel like Shazam was just such a fun time. What a oh my god, Shazam was amazing. I really enjoyed Shazam. Again, you have those horror elements because of David S. Sandberg's background in the genre, but it's also a really fun film that explores a type of character that we don't often see represented in the superhero genre, and indeed in film overall, and that is this young boy who's in the foster care system, and it explores his experience as a child who is in the care system, who does have foster parents, and he oftentimes is a little bit disruptive. Okay, he's a little bit of a hooligan, but becoming this superhero in Shazam gives him a new sense of purpose, a new sense of focus. And then you also have, of course, Zachary Levi portraying the titular character, the superhero that is born out of this little kid, and he has to balance out being Billy Batson whilst at the same time being Shazam, this kind of Superman level hero. And ultimately you just have like this, again, very fun, entertaining, different film. And like I said, I appreciate the DC films that aren't as serious, that aren't as dour. I'm over it. Like, I've never been into that kind of tone for a superhero movie, and so I appreciated Shazam. It just felt like a breath of fresh air. And this film, to its credit, and indeed to the credit of David S. Sandberg, does also have one of the most memorable sequences, in my opinion, in a DCEU film, and that is the office sequence. That scene where those horrible, ugly monsters, those horrible, ugly monsters that represent the 7 sins are in that office, and you don't even see the action scene. That's how you elevate a PG-13, by the way, in my opinion, is that you don't even get to see the actual violence and gore, so you can still get away with the PG-13 rating, but it's implied through this like translucent screen, and that whole scene setup was just so brilliant. And again, it was David S. Sandberg delving into his horror roots and utilizing it in this perfect way. Okay, so next up, we're delving into the top 3. Okay, we're no longer playing games, we're delving into my choice for the top 3 DCEU films. And at number 3, we have Wonder Woman, the first female-led superhero film of this, you know, more recent superhero renaissance period that we have been in. And honestly, I remember the day when I sat down to watch this film in the cinema and was just so pleasantly surprised to see how much I'd enjoyed it. Because listen, this was 2017, okay? Do you remember where the DCEU was at in 2017 after the disaster that was 2016? Please, okay? It's a wonder that I was in the cinema to see this to begin with, but I was pleasantly surprised. Yes, I was pleasantly surprised because the film delivered. What can I say? First of all, one thing that I've always enjoyed about the DCEU that I wish they would do more of, actually, was the incorporation of Greco-Roman mythology in this superhero franchise. I think that's like a very interesting angle that they haven't quite exploited enough, like the idea of Wonder Woman being this figure from Greco-Roman myth and kind of being tied up into all of that. As someone who is a really big fan of that kind of mythology and exploring it, I would love to see this kind of crossover between Greco-Roman mythology and I guess modern day mythology in superhero culture. Like, I feel like that's a really great crossover that the DCEU can make use of more so than they already have done, especially through the characters of Wonder Woman and Aquaman, in a similar way to how Marvel has Thor, who is based off of Norse mythology. We also have Gal Gadot, who, as I already mentioned in my Batman v Superman breakdown, I feel like was done so much more justice in her appearance in her own film as opposed to her entry into the DCEU in Batman v Superman. I know that a bunch of people were a fan of her at that point, but I just feel like here she's so much better, and in the sequel she's better still. And speaking of MCU comparisons, because apparently I love to do that, apparently that's all that I do in this channel, but there is no denying that this film does have strong Captain America the First Avenger feels, except instead of being set in World War II, it's set in World War I. And it certainly doesn't help that the male somewhat co-lead in this film is also another Chris and his character is also called Steve. Okay, so you know, and you could also again see the similarities between Wonder Woman and the first Thor film, in that she starts off in this like mythical island and then she goes off into the land of man, except on that front I will say that Wonder Woman did a better job job of having this kind of fish out of water moment for the character. That kind of mashup of Thor and Captain America the First Avenger really works in her favor, because she's not just kind of wandering around looking for her hammer, as is the case for Thor in the first Thor film. She's actually partaking in a war. She sees the horrors of war, which is something that has always struck me about this film. There are just horrible scenes of people suffering and in pain and having these horrible injuries as a result of being in the battlefield. And then of course you have that sequence in No Man's Land where she is just running through, and I mean, what a beautiful sequence. Like, truly, what a beautiful sequence. That is the kind of moment that has meaning, that has weight to it, that honestly Zack Snyder could never. That's the difference, is that the meaning is that the substance is there. That is the difference between having a director who's all style and no substance, and a director who actually takes the time to build that meaning, to build that weight in the character and in this circumstance that all leads up to this tense moment to make one of the most iconic sequences in all of this franchise. So next up, at number 2, we have Joker. Now, after the release of The Dark Knight in 2008, it became almost impossible to envision anyone else taking the mantle of one of the most iconic DC villains ever, after the incredible portrayal of the character by Heath Ledger and shortly before he sadly passed away. But Todd Phillips decided that he wanted to take on this mission, and he brought on board Joaquin Phoenix to fulfill this role. And this ultimately ended up with him getting the Academy Award for Best Lead Actor, which means he must have done something right. He must have gotten something right in his portrayal of one of the most iconic comic book characters. Now, I've always said, okay, quite controversially, that I think The Dark Knight is quite overrated. I think The Dark Knight is quite overrated. Maybe one day, if I'm feeling brave, I will delve into all of the issues that I've had with The Dark Knight over the years, but just for now, we're going to focus in on the Joker element, because whilst I think that the Joker is definitely the best part of The Dark Knight, I feel like one shortfall of the character is that we never really get a full understanding of where this character comes from, his backstory, his motives. Whilst I completely understand and appreciate the fact that this kind of mystery surrounding the character is a huge part of the mythos of the character and his popularity, I personally prefer it when you do have a bit more of an understanding of where the villain is coming from, so it doesn't feel like the villain is a bad guy for the sake of being a bad guy, which I think is somewhat the case with the Dark Knight's iteration of the character. But here we have a whole film centered around this fascinating character from DC Comics, and I think that this film did a great job of delving into the psyche of the Joker, and indeed exploring the topic of mental health and how people with mental health issues are let down by society every single day within the superhero genre. I feel like having that discussion in this genre was absolutely phenomenal. You guys have heard me say this so many times at this point, but I really like social commentary in superhero movies and projects overall. I just find them to be so grounding. It brings it back to earth. It makes it more relatable, and it also means that the artists and the filmmakers are able to kind of make a point about certain things that are reflected in our society, but put them in the context of superheroing to kind of soften the blow a little bit, but it's still very relevant, and that we've seen this time and time again at this point. But in the case of Joker, it very much specifically honed in on the experience of someone who has a mental illness and how he is treated by society and let down by the system that ultimately ends up creating the villain in him. Now, I already have a whole review of Joker, so I won't be delving into it in a lot of depth here, but I will say, of course, one of the biggest critiques of the film is that it's very derivative of Martin Scorsese's work, particularly Taxi Driver and King of Comedy. I've already talked about how some of these other DC films are very derivative or heavily inspired by other works already, so whilst I dock off a few points for lack of originality, I will say say that overall it does make for a very unique viewing experience, considering again that it's in the context of the superhero genre, focusing on one of the most iconic comic book villains ever. And finally, at number one, just by process of elimination, we can see that there's only one option left. There's only one option left for number one, for the very best DCEU movie to date, and that is of course The Suicide Squad, directed by James Gunn, because he did the thing. He did what needed to be done and he absolutely understood the assignment and gave us the best DCEU film to date, in my humble opinion. Now listen, I may be suffering from an acute sense of recency bias, okay, I can admit that, but I will say from start to finish, I feel like The Suicide Squad is just literally such a blast. First of all, as I already mentioned, of course, I enjoy superhero movies that don't take themselves too seriously, that aren't so dour and brooding and depressing. I love that injection of fun and levity, but clever comedy as well, which James Gunn does to a certain extent. There is a lot of teenage boy comedy, as I mentioned in my review of the film, but I do feel like for the most part he is very smart and clever with his comedy, and also in general with the portrayal of team dynamics. As I mentioned in my review of the film, James Gunn has really honed in on the skill of being able to bring together this like ragtag team of horrible, deplorable people who come from all of these various backgrounds, and just bringing them together to form this like really likable, tight-knit unit. And one thing that cannot be overstated when it comes to James Gunn's The Suicide Squad is that this is an R-rated film. We have seen the DCEU push out several R-rated films over the years. We had Birds of Prey, Joker, although that's technically not DCEU, but whatever. We also had Zack Snyder's Justice League earlier this year. But no. This is an R-rated film. It is so different to its other DC siblings. It feels like an entirely different animal altogether, but it also works, okay? Because yes, there is a lot of gratuitous violence. There's even a sex scene in here, which we rarely get in all of these superhero movies. But because the story is good, because the character arcs are convincing, the team dynamics are engaging, and also the film itself looks stunning, okay, the cinematography is excellent, because you have a well-made film surrounding the violence and the blood and the gore and the swearing. It doesn't feel like a gimmick, it just feels like a very well-developed world in which this violence is just like a natural part of it. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my ranking of the DCEU films, or the DC adjacent films, it's time for you guys to let me know what your ranking of the DC films are down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.